Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Justin Reynolds. I am the Director of Research Initiatives at the ACUOI Central Office. And welcome to today's webinar, Exploring How Academic, Social, and Deeper Life Interactions Influence Thriving for Living Learning Community Students. This webinar is based on a study funded by the association in April of 2019. The funded research grant program began in 2015 and is sponsored by the ACUOI Foundation and bedloft.com. If you'd like more information about ACUOI's research programs, you can email research@acuo-i.org. And if you have any questions at any point throughout the presentation, you can feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Ryan Irk to share more about his research project. Ryan.
Awesome. Thanks, Justin. Hey everyone, thanks for that introduction. Thanks to all who might find themselves watching this webinar either now or after it's been recorded, just to learn a little bit more about our recent study on interactions and student success for living learning community students. So I'll talk a little bit about kind of our research team, who we are momentarily, but before I get any further, I just want to highlight that my colleague in this project, Dr. Rishi Sriram, is on paternity leave, so he's not able to join us this afternoon. So anyway, I'll be rocking this webinar by myself, but I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. So the title of our presentation today from our study is Exploring How Academic, Social, and Deeper Life Interactions Influence Thriving for Living Learning Community Students. As with all virtual presentations, my fingers are crossed that technology does not go awry, but if anything happens, then we'll make sure that we reconnect as soon as possible. So with that, our itinerary is pretty straightforward. I'd first like to talk about our team, give some acknowledgements, and then after that, I'm going to jump into right into lit review, results, methods, results discussion from this work. Then talk a little bit about some recommendations that we can pull from what we found, and specifically some things that might benefit those working in housing related roles, and then wrap up with any questions that are not answered along the way. So as Justin mentioned, my name is Ryan. I serve as a program director for one of our residential learning communities at Baylor University. I'm in my second year in this role, but I have some previous experience working with a couple different living learning centers. So my colleague is Dr. Rishi Sriram. He's an associate professor of higher ed and student affairs. He's also the faculty in residence, or excuse me, faculty steward of Brooks Residential College here at Baylor. We also want to give kind of a big nod of gratitude to ACUOI just for helping us fund this study, particularly the participant incentives. Thanks to the ACUOI Foundation just for having a great grant program, allowing us to participate. Especially want to thank Justin as the Director of Research Initiatives. He's just been real helpful in offering guidance and answering my many questions and emails throughout the grant funded process. Also want to thank the Thriving Project at Azusa Pacific under the leadership of Dr. Lori Schreiner, just for permission to use the Thriving Quotient instrument. And finally, just want to say thanks to the institutional partners who helped us get our survey into the hands of students. And thanks also just to the students who participated and took the time to respond to our survey and gave us some really neat data to work with. So with that, jump kind of into some background and context. So for years, scholars have attempted to define student success, and faculty and administrators and practitioners have attempted to construct interventions and programs and initiatives that would influence success. And this has proved to be a challenge, right? Because success just means different things to different people. So what do we mean when we say student success? Is it a high GPA? Is it first year retention, persistence to graduation? Is it job placement post-graduation? Some might say it's captured in how students engage or involve themselves on campus? And I would say yes, right? It's all of these things. But classifying a student as successful based on a single measure or from observations only around uh, one area of their life, I would argue that it offers an incomplete picture. So in this study, we argue that a more holistic approach can allow us to craft interventions that more strongly contribute to a successful college experience. But we also argue, perhaps more importantly, that the opportunities for interactions that students have make up one of those real meaningful contributors. So there's kind of three main elements in this study that I'm going to talk about. So there's interactions, living learning communities, and student success. So I'm going to kind of walk through some relevant research that's related to these as I kind of along the way set the stage for how we approach this project conceptually. So regarding interactions, the first question is that we're asking is what type of interactions are we talking about? So in the literature around this, there's a kind of big emphasis on interactions related to the academic and sort of social spheres of a student's experience. So when we're talking about academic interactions, talking about intellectual stimulation, connections to faculty, about classes, conversations about schedules, academic support, resources, major, career. When we're talking about social interactions, these are a little bit more casual, often more lighthearted, kind of reflecting the social elements or the social nature of the college experience. And so this common framework, this sort of academic social framework, I believe is sort of derived from the work of Vincent Tinto and his theory of student departure that really articulates kind of the academic and social experiences as two sides to what I kind of like to call the student success coin. And so Tinto's framework is really helpful. There's been a lot of research that has sort of stemmed from his theory of student departure, but I would argue that using those two categories, those academic and social categories, when we talk about interactions, it can be limiting. So Sriram and McIlvaine note that there's something deeper than social interaction when we talk about how students interact. It's called deeper life interactions. So deeper life interactions occur around life's big questions. They occur around students' purpose and value and meaning making, often through role modeling and emotional or psychosocial support. And some recent research actually notes that these are legitimately distinct from academic and social interactions. We can measure them through reliable scales in the same way that we measure academic and social interaction, and they really do benefit students. And so, as you can see here, is kind of our first layer of our conceptual framework, and using the red text there that we're asking what type of interactions. And the dotted line that you'll see on there, that really kind of represents where certain elements of this study filled a gap in literature. And so I'll talk more about that as we go on. So the second question that we're asking in this framework is with whom do interactions occur? Who are students interacting with? Again, kind of primary focus of interactions in the literature is student-faculty interactions and student-peer interactions. I would think, or I would offer, again, I think that's probably derived from, maybe even subconsciously, right, derived from Tinto's kind of academic and social domains when he's talking about integration. So we look at faculty, right, kind of connected to the academic, students' peers kind of connected to the social. And so I think that can be a helpful framework. I also think only having those two areas is limiting because it really misses a vital opportunity to see the influence of professional staff. And so I'm getting a question here that I don't mind answering right now. Do deeper life interactions typically happen in more of a religious realm? I just Googled and that came up. So that's a really good question. So I think that it's important to differentiate religious and Aston and Lindholm's work on spirituality. And so I think deeper life interactions might be more in the realm of exploring spirituality if that's where that question is going. So I don't think that deeper life interactions by any means are limited to conversations about religiosity or religious topics of conversation. But really good question. So some scholars have highlighted when we're talking about student-staff interaction, they've highlighted some benefits there. But when we look in the literature and we're exploring that, staff more often than not get rejected as a point of meaningful interaction. And so that is actually kind of where our kind of second layer of our conceptual framework is. And so when we talk about who do students interact with, common focus on faculty, common focus on peers, but we also think it's really vital to look at staff in there as well. And so that gets us to our next element of the study, which is living learning communities. So living learning communities, and some of you probably know these as LLCs, these embody a kind of holistic experience where they blend the curricular and the co-curricular, the in and out of class, heavily involve faculty, staff, and students, peers, all kind of into that ideal of residential education. And there's a lot of research that attempts to define how LLC participation influences success. But we're diving more into kind of the processes and specifically the interactions that could explain this. And so I guess I really want to be clear here, though LLCs are kind of a part of the context and the framework that we use in the study, that environment in itself is not our focus. Mainly, we incorporate living learning communities because they espouse to create the interactions that we're interested in studying. I kind of argue that they're one of, if not the best space on a college campus to observe interactions, because interactions with faculty, staff, and peers are consistently promoted kind of all in one space. So it's kind of like these communities serve as really good laboratories, so to say, for studying interaction. So next step of our framework is here, kind of denoting our delimiter of looking at students who are participating in LLCs. And so the dotted line there, again, is just kind of meant to represent the fact that students have these interactions with these constituents all over campus. These interactions are not limited to living learning communities, but we're focusing on students in LLCs because their environment is situated to be a very strong promoter of these interactions. So that gets us to our outcomes of the study, so student success. So we group success kind of when looking in the literature into kind of two big theoretical chunks. One, sort of around concepts like persistence and retention and completion through the work of scholars like Tinto and Spady and Levitz. And then another area through research threads around like involvement and quality of effort and engagement through researchers like Aston and Pace and Koo. And while all of these areas are informative, right, we want to promote persistence. We want to promote engagement with our students. We want to promote 1 year retention and graduation. I think that they individually don't amount to holistic success, right? Success in multiple areas of a student's life. Again, they should all be promoted, but if we use these elements like persistence or retention or completion in a silo to classify a student as successful, I think it's problematic. They're often looked at as deficit-based. They're pressured through metrics like US News and World Report, and they're really often framed as results-oriented. I think that results are important. I think it's just as important, if not more, to ask what are the processes that lead to those results? What's allowing us to get there? So alternatively, college student thriving It focuses on the psychological, there's kind of elements of the sociological woven in. And thriving doesn't replace concepts like involvement or engagement or completion, or some of those other theories, but I would argue that it necessarily supplements them. In a way, it sort of binds them together. So thriving is comprised of 5 factors that were established from a diverse array of success literature, and those are engaged learning, academic determination, social connectedness, diverse citizenship, and positive perspective. And so, as you can see, this kind of final layer of our conceptual framework here is leading from interactions, asking what is the influence from those interactions to student success, and specifically the factors of student thriving. So using this conceptual framework as a guide, we developed the following research question. So how do academic, social, and deeper life interactions with peers, faculty, and staff influence thriving for living learning community students? So kind of explained a little bit about the conceptual underpinnings for the study based on relevant literature. And from there, kind of identified the research question and didn't realize how many red arrows were on this PowerPoint until right now. But to put that into kind of a theoretical understanding into kind of measurable actions, we created this hypothesized path model. So this, in a way, is kind of the statistical version, so to say, of our conceptual framework. But this allowed us to implement that conceptual framework by using data collection instruments, and then move ahead to exploring the research question. And then there's a lot going on here, right? There's a lot of lines, a lot of circles, and I'll explain a little bit more about this as we go on. But from here, I'll jump into the methodology of the study. So to collect data for the study, we first secured IRB approval at our institution. We utilized our personal networks, including help from Justin. So big thanks there. But we got our data collection proposal in front of individuals at 40 different universities. So from that group, eight institutions allowed us to survey their students. So, excuse me. So the theoretical population there was all undergraduate students in living learning communities at 4-year universities, but the utilized population was the students at those 8 campuses where we are allowed to collect data. So that was just over 4,800 students. From that group, about 1,300 students returned the survey, which roughly a 27% response rate, so it's decent. But after screening the data, we had a usable sample of 903 participants. I included a couple of the kind of key characteristics of the sample there. So it's primarily first year, female, and white. So in terms of instrumentation, so we combined 2 instruments for our survey here, the thriving quotient and the academic, social, and deeper life interactions instrument, which allowed us to get our kind of final survey for the study. Both of those instruments were shown to be valid and reliable. And then we took the data gathered through those instruments, which we collected last year, and we started an analysis using structural equation modeling, or SEM. And so for this study, we kind of focused mainly on 2 fit measures, which just kind of explain how well the collected data fit the theoretically informed model that I referenced earlier. So those were CFI with thresholds near 0.95, that's confirmatory fit index, or root mean squared error approximation, or RMSEA, with a threshold near 0.06. So with that, I'll jump into some fun stuff with the results. So the first thing we did with the data was we ran multiple confirmatory factor analyses, and these really just allowed us to test whether the scale items that we had accurately and strongly contributed to the latent factors that we were using. So through looking at excellent fit measures, excellent reliability, and factor loadings all above 0.40. This allowed us to confirm that each item actually explained the construct that it was intended to measure. And so we could include each measurement scale that you see here on this list in our structural equation model. So from the theorized pathways that we predicted from analyzing the literature in that path model that I showed earlier, some of those relationships were non-significant, and so we deleted those first. The software we utilized, which was analysis of moment structures, or AMOS, which is a add-on package to SPSS, it suggested some changes, or what we call modification indices. And so we implemented 3 that we deemed theoretically justified. So we regressed some of the thriving factors onto themselves, or I should say onto other thriving factors. We added 2 additional pathways, and then we correlated some of the error terms. And so finally, after doing all this, which is called the modeling process, a model emerged that offered excellent CFI and RMSEA output, as seen here. Okay, so what does all this mean? So again, this was kind of that initial hypothesized model. As a reminder, the variables that you see on the left side of the screen there, those represent all the interactions that we measured. So if you look at the top, SIP is social interactions with peers. You go down, AIF, academic interactions with faculty. DLIP is deeper life interactions with peers, so on. And then the right side just represents our outcomes, those 5 thriving factors. After the modeling process, we arrived at this final structural equation model. So I know that those numbers might be small, and there's a lot of kind of lines going on. So I'm going to break some of these relationships down a little bit. But the first thing I want to do is kind of talking about some of those results, is mentioning our squared multiple correlations, or our R-squared values of the final model. So these really just tell us the amount of variance in each thriving factor that's captured by interactions and student scores on other thriving factors. So for example, if we see this small table here, we could say that the interactions students have, along with their scores and other thriving factors, account for about 51% of the variance in their engaged learning. If you go to diverse citizenship there, when I say the interactions students have, along with thriving scores, account for about 53.7% of their variance in diverse citizenship. So these outputs, they really give us kind of a bigger picture understanding of how the full model contributed to these dependent variables. And I'll talk more on this and kind of the strength of the specific interaction variables when I get kind of deeper into the discussion in a minute. But before that, I do want to mention we also ran what's called a multiple indicators or multiple causes or mimic model. So this allowed us to group interaction variables and to their bigger categories, and then define thriving as kind of a composite student success variable. And so the results here were also very telling. So by focusing specifically on the type of interaction students have, we see that social, academic, and deeper life interactions all contributed strongly or very strongly to general student thriving. And so with that, collectively, the interactions accounted for 66% of the variance in college student thriving. So this really speaks to kind of the power of interactions and kind of how powerful interactions can be for college students regarding their success. So before I kind of get a little bit more into explaining the results, I want to show you this visual. So we created this to kind of give a snapshot, I guess, of the strongest contributions from those interaction variables to the thriving factor. So this doesn't include all the pathways that were in the final model that I showed. Instead, this graph or this visual really demonstrates where interactions were shown to be the most powerful towards thriving. So in a way, kind of like a highlight reel, so to say. And I should say, because there's kind of a lot going on in those findings, as I mentioned, we use those strongest connections to sort of frame some of the discussion points. So to explain these, kind of broke them into the 5 factors of the 5 categories of the 5 thriving factors. So the first is engaged learning. So this is defined as energy invested in learning, evidenced by meaningful processing and involvement in the learning activities. So the model explained 51% of the variance in this factor. Deeper life interactions with faculty staff had strong effects. So these demonstrate the connections that students make with professors regarding their purpose or their value or their meaning. And it shows that those conversations can really be a strong motivator for learning. Academic with faculty, also a large contributor. So these interactions lead students to feel energized by their classes and to apply their coursework to other areas of their life. The next area is academic determination. So this is embodied in the attitudes and behaviors that empower students to just persevere through difficult academic situations and endure academic challenges or challenging academic goals. But the final model explained 51.2% of the variance in academic determination construct. Deeper life with faculty staff had the strongest effects. This just kind of substantiates a central element of academic determination, which is the concept of hope. So students, kind of shown in the related research, students exhibiting high levels of hope believe that they can reach their goals. And with these results, I'd argue that deeper life interactions can spur that hope that drives students toward achieving academically. Academic with peers, also a strong predictor. So this stresses student proximity in LLCs. We often see that through like peer study groups or programs that allow students to kind of partner up on their academic journey. And academic interactions with faculty, also a strong direct predictor. So the way that these connect to academic determination really get at the heart of thriving. And what I mean by that is when students have academic conversations with faculty, not only is their performance bolstered in the classroom, their academic performance, but it also helps them to psychologically engage in the learning, which is really important. Social connectedness, so this represents the actions and emotions that are concentrated around students' relationships and their social lives. The model explained 46.9% of the variance here. Deeper life with peers was the strongest predictor. In fact, this was the strongest single predictor among all of the thriving variables in the model. Although social connectedness often has a lower mean score in a lot of the thriving research, this connection validates, I think, the importance of deeper life to social connections. And we see this again through, perhaps peer proximity in LLCs, where, students are provided kind of ample opportunities for such interactions. So they really help reinforce friendships, they help reinforce relationships, but more so, they help students feel psychologically connected. This was really evidenced in how the connection from deeper life interactions with peers to social connectedness was actually stronger than the connection from social interactions with peers to social connectedness. And then finally, students' social interactions with peers had a moderate effect. So again, things like peer support networks, often present in LLCs through things like structured study groups or mentor groups, can really cultivate this. That gets us to diverse citizenship. I know there's a lot of factors here. So this is a combination of openness and valuing differences. It also includes students' desire and confidence to make a community contribution. The model explained 53.7% of the variance here. Deeper life with faculty staff had the strongest total effect. So this supports some previous literature on how students' conversations with faculty in non-academic settings can really help them grow civic values. Social with peers, a moderate influence. It's interesting to note that other studies actually found at larger institutions, attendance at larger institutions can have a significant negative influence on civic or humanitarian values. But I really think these results here counter that claim. All the institutions that were in our study had over 15,000 students. All 8 of the institutions where we surveyed students had over 15,000 students enrolled. And so I think this really shows the progress that larger institutions have made towards fostering holistic success. And I argue that environments like living learning communities at some of these bigger schools can provide social interactions and kind of a psychologically safe space with their peers. And that, in turn, as seen through these results, can lead to outcomes like diverse citizenship. Positive perspective is a thriving student's outlook on life, includes viewing reality honestly to cope with what is real versus what is expected. So the model explained 28% of the variance in this construct. Deeper life with faculty staff was a large contributor. This was the 4th largest contributor in the model. So this shows kind of that an optimistic perspective on life can stem from conversations that go deeper, that involve concepts about value and meaning. And it really reinforces that interactions beyond academic and social can be important for psychological thriving. Academic interactions with staff moderately contributed, as did deeper life interactions with peers. A note here is none of the social interaction variables influence positive perspective. And so this contradicts some of the previous literature, but it just seems here that participants kind of felt their deeper life interactions contributed to their intrapersonal well-being more than their social interactions. And so that power of deeper life that I'm mentioning was actually really strongly confirmed in our mimic model with general interaction groups. So this supports that interaction studies should not be limited to academic and social experiences. That deeper life, it can be really meaningful and it is really powerful. Academic interactions, again, also strongly contributed to overall thriving. This shows that interactions regarding things like course material or schedules or academic support resources are really crucial to success, but it also demonstrates how important the psychological assurance of having academically supported people on campus can be for students. And then additionally, social interactions had a strong impact. So this was though this was the lowest group, this was an interesting finding, especially given that the interpersonal variables, thriving variables, which are social connectedness and diverse citizenship, they contain the majority of the significant pathways in the structural model. Social and academic interactions, they dominate the literature, but the findings here, I think, really show that the greatest contributors to holistic college student success are their interactions with peers, faculty, and staff the students are having that occur around things like meaning and value and purpose, which are those deeper life interactions. Okay, so I've kind of laid out what we've found in this study, kind of how it meshes with the literature. And now to answer the question, so what? What do we do with this information as professionals or faculty in roles that are in or work closely with housing and residence life departments? What can we pull from this? So I want to kind of hit on 5 recommendations that I think are probably relevant to those in housing related roles. So the first is to foster deeper life interactions. If you heard me say it enough, this study and other recent studies really make the case that deeper life interactions are very powerful in terms of looking at student success. Promoting these interactions, though, is not that easy, right? It takes time and it takes energy and it takes mental stamina to engage students in conversations about meaning and value and purpose. For faculty, especially those in, for example, faculty and residence positions, this might really include using your imagination to re-envision office hours or to go deeper in conversation at programs or even in private dialogue with students. It might even be dramatic as rethinking where faculty offices are. Right? I know that there's, especially in terms of living learning communities and residential colleges, situating faculty or advising offices in the residence hall. It's kind of noted as a best practice. So thinking about how can we encourage that? How can we continue to promote that? How can we situate faculty, right in the direct path of students, for example, in their residence hall? I think that can continue to prove very valuable. For professional staff, like hall directors, this might include, altering or rethinking supervisory styles, even considering how you might weave deeper life conversations into your work with RAs or even other residents you interact with. And though it's kind of a stretch, though it's hard to do, I really think places like conduct conversations can have some really ripe opportunity to get students to reflect on their meaning and to reflect on their purpose. But again, I know that is a challenge to weave something like this in there. But that flows to kind of the second suggestion, so which is encouraging living learning community or LLC participation. So LLCs are conducive to increased interactions with faculty and with staff and with students' peers. But it's important that they maximize that opportunity. As our data showed, even at large institutions, these communities can really help make campus more navigable, more digestible, so to say, for students. So I encourage those involved in LLCs to consider how interactions play a role, right? And not a secondary role or merely an indirect outcome, but as a real source of success for the students involved. But as you know, not all students participate in LLCs, and not all campuses are. They pursue an LLC model with their housing, and so that leads to a third implication, which is opportunities for interaction really need to be spread across residence halls. So there's some really neat research that highlights is Karen Nicholas and a few others, I think, highlight what's called the secondhand effect of emulating LLC type programming in other environments. And so kind of what they looked at in that study is a residence hall with a subset of that hall being a living learning center, and students who are in the hall but not a part of that program, how they actually benefited from being in the same environment. I firmly believe, though, that it's the interactions there that ought to be targeted, or the opportunities for interaction in LLCs that ought to be targeted. So this might include giving non-LLC students access to resources in these communities. And it can also come from simple changes, like arranging student lounge furniture near some of those faculty or staff offices in residence halls to really encourage and promote that interaction. So related to this, another recommendation is that some of our campus programs, they need to really value staff engagement. And I'm not just talking about the staff that work with these programs or in residence halls, but I'm talking about staff from across campus being invited into our spaces to interact with our students because we realize the value of those interactions. professional staff have credentials and they have life experiences. I say they, we, that's me too, that can really provide value for students. So speaking at programs, facilitating workshops, even just stopping by residence hall to greet students can help. In some related literature on interactions, it's actually shown that when students have academic interactions, they are keenly aware of when they're talking to a faculty member and when they're talking to a staff member. But when students are having social or deeper life interactions, they actually do not differentiate as strongly when they're talking to a faculty or staff member. So at the end of the day, I think staff members should not be perceived as a second best option to including faculty in their programming, but rather I think they should really be perceived as or prioritized as a resourceful connection. And then the kind of last implication for practice is related to outcomes. So our ideas of success need to embody a holistic approach. This is tricky. I know there are a lot of competing goals out there on our campuses. For those in residence life and housing, asking questions like how can we look beyond program attendance for marks of student success? How can we look beyond GPAs of our residents to determine their success? How can we look beyond retention of our first year residents to explore what policies contribute the most to thriving? So your assessment for on-campus living probably, at least I hope it does, has clearly defined outcomes. But my question is, does it include outcomes that together or collectively embody what we want holistic success to be for our students? If success is our idea, or if our ideas of success are limited to kind of singular outcomes or single areas of a student's life, I think it just continues to silo our work, right? Like we need to think about success that's in a more comprehensive way. So those are a couple things to think about. And one more thing is, but what about COVID, right? So I felt like I couldn't do a webinar about this and not include something about COVID. So with COVID, it feels strange talking about interactions when we're advised, or rather forced, to avoid such a thing, especially when it comes to programming with students. So I think it'd be really fascinating to explore how technology influences interaction, as that is a large part of what we're doing these days. And I understand the irony there of saying that over a Zoom call. But given the state of things, I'm really left wondering, are online interactions the future of interactions? And so I think really only time will tell what the long-term effects of COVID are in terms of interaction. So kind of starting to wrap up here, though it varies depending on what type and with whom, college student interactions through the study that we conducted here were shown to greatly contribute to college student success. And so with most interactions happening virtually, again, I'm just left wondering, does it matter where they happen? So that will maybe be a question that we can answer next time. But with that, I just want to say thank you all for listening. Whether you're here with us live or whether you're listening to the recorded version of this, I appreciate you just taking the time to hear a little bit about our study. Our kind of hope is that we can take this data set that we have and kind of dig a little bit deeper, specifically into how some student characteristics, like how this might look for sophomore, junior, senior versus first year students. And so we actually want to do some more research on that soon. So hopefully stay tuned for that. Our contact info is here.